She stood alone at the harvest dance, wearing last year's dress, until a quiet rancher chose her. Lila Mercer stood near the far wall of the hall, hands folded at her waist, wearing the same pale blue dress she had worn the year before. The hem carefully resewn where it had frayed, the sleeves altered to hide the thinning fabric, and though no one said it outright, every woman in the room had already noticed. The music had started twice without her moving, and the third song was nearly finished when Hale Mercer stepped too close, looked at the dress, and said loud enough for the table beside him to hear, "Freight money must have been thinner than we thought." A few men chuckled, not cruelly, but comfortably, the way people laugh when someone else becomes the safer target. Lila did not answer. She did not leave. She simply adjusted her gloves and kept her chin level, which somehow irritated Hale more than any reply might have. He leaned in slightly and added, "Some debts follow a name longer than a widow can carry it." The room shifted before she could respond. Boots stopped against the wood floor, a chair scraped back. Gideon Clarke stepped forward from the side of the hall, not hurried, not loud, just direct. He did not look at Hale. He did not look at the dress. He looked at Lila. "May I have this one?" he asked, as if the room had not just tightened around her. No one expected her to accept. She did. They stepped into the center of the floor, and the music resumed in a strained half-beat before settling into rhythm. Gideon's hand was steady at her back, respectful distance, no pressure. He did not speak at first. He did not ask about Hale. He did not offer comfort. He simply danced as though the invitation had been ordinary. Halfway through the turn, he said quietly, "Your husband never lost that freight." Her step faltered for half a breath. "You weren't there." "No," he answered, "but I was closer than most." The meaning settled between them without explanation. He knew something, more than town gossip, more than rumor. At the edge of the floor, Hale watched, expression unchanged, fingers tapping against his belt buckle. When the song ended, Gideon walked Lila back to her place without flourish. Hale stepped aside only when Gideon stopped directly in front of him. "You're making a mistake," Hale said calmly. Gideon adjusted his cuffs once. "No," he replied. "I'm correcting one." The room did not breathe until Gideon moved away. As Lila reached for her gloves again, she noticed something no one else had. Gideon had entered through the side door, not the front. The side door faced the freight road, and his boots carried fresh dust that did not belong to this town. He had not come for the dance, and he had not stepped forward by accident. She unlocked her barn before sunrise and stopped before she reached the door because the ground told her something had changed. Fresh hoof marks circled the structure in a slow, deliberate loop, not passing through, not tying off, just riding around and around as if measuring it, and the pattern was too careful to belong to a wandering traveler. She did not call out. She stepped closer and saw the feed sack near the wall slit open cleanly along its seam, grain spilling across the dirt but not stolen, which made it worse because theft would have been simple while this was meant to be seen. She crouched, ran her fingers through the grain, then stood and checked the latch. It had been lifted and set back without breaking, a quiet message left by someone who wanted her to know he could enter whenever he chose. She was still studying the marks when Gideon Clarke rode up without hurry, dismounted, and walked the circle once before speaking. "He wants you unsettled," he said, not asking who. Lila crossed her arms. If he wanted something, he would take it. Gideon bent near the tack rail and held up a leather strap, one buckle sliced halfway through, not enough to fail immediately, but enough to snap under strain. "No," he said evenly. "He wants you to ride thinking you're safe." The implication landed harder than the damage. Lila took the strap from his hand and examined the cut. It was clean, deliberate, not the work of accident or wear. "He thinks I'll leave," she said. Gideon met her eyes without softening his tone. "He thinks pressure will do what rumor didn't." She turned away and began sweeping the spilled grain into a bucket, refusing to rush, refusing to let the circle of hoofprints dictate her pace, and Gideon did not interrupt her or offer reassurance. He simply repaired the strap with a temporary stitch that would hold until replaced. When she finished, she walked the perimeter herself and stopped at the far corner where one hoof mark pressed deeper than the rest, as if the rider had paused there to watch the house. Gideon followed her gaze toward the rise beyond the fence line and said quietly, "He's testing how far I'll stand." Lila did not answer that. Instead, she lifted the repaired strap and said, "Then let him test." Gideon nodded once, mounted again, and before he rode off, he added in the same measured voice, "If he circles again, I won't." The meaning was not threat, but boundary. After he left, Lila stepped inside the barn and found something she had not noticed at first. A small length of blue thread caught on the splintered wood of the doorframe, the same shade Hale favored in his riding coat. It was not proof, not enough to accuse, but enough to confirm intention. She closed the barn doors slowly, aware that this was no longer gossip carried inside a dance hall. This was a man who preferred quiet intimidation, and he had moved from words to calculation. As she turned back toward the house, she realized the tracks did not end at the barn. They angled once toward the freight road before disappearing into harder ground, the same road Gideon had entered from the night before. He had known. He had come through that side door for a reason, and if he had already been watching the road, then this morning was not a surprise to him. By mid-morning, the story had already moved ahead of her, because when Lila stepped into the mercantile to replace the ruined feed, conversation dipped just enough to confirm that Hale had spoken first. Two men near the stove were discussing the missing freight bonds, again, careful not to use her husband's name directly, and the storekeeper avoided her eyes while counting flour sacks, as though numbers required more attention than truth. She paid in coin, not credit, and turned to leave when Gideon entered through the rear door carrying a small folded paper that did not belong to this town, its edges marked with road dust and handling creases. He did not greet her in a familiar way. He simply set the paper on the counter and asked the storekeeper, "Did you ever see this?" The man glanced at it, then at Hale, who stood by the window pretending interest in a crate of nails, and shook his head too quickly. Lila looked down and recognized the freight registry mark from her husband's final route, the seal broken but not discarded. Gideon spoke plainly, not loudly. That shipment cleared 3 days before the accident. The word accident hung heavier than freight. Hale turned then, expression calm. "Records can be altered?" Gideon did not argue. "Not this one." He slid the paper toward Lila and said quietly, "Your husband delivered what he was hired to deliver." The implication did not accuse Hale outright, but it rearranged the room. If the freight was delivered, then something else had been taken after. Hale's gaze sharpened. "You're reaching." Gideon replied, "I don't reach, I confirm." The men near the stove fell silent, and for the first time since the dance, doubt did not circle Lila. It circled Hale. She felt the shift, small but real, and it steadied her more than comfort would have. Outside the store, Gideon walked with her towards the hitch rail and said without lowering his voice, "He built his leverage on a rumor." Lila folded the paper carefully. "And now?" "Now he knows I've seen the ledger he didn't burn." That detail stopped her. "You've known this since the dance." Gideon met her eyes evenly. "I knew enough." He did not elaborate, and she did not press, because pressing might reveal more than she was prepared to hear. As she mounted, she noticed a boy standing near the corner, watching Hale through the window, then running off toward the freight road. Gideon saw it too. "He'll try something different," he said. "Men who lose ground don't retreat quietly." The warning was not dramatic. It was practical. They rode part way together before separating at the crossroads, and as Lila reached her gate, she saw that the barn door she had latched that morning now stood half an inch ajar again, not wide enough to suggest entry, but open enough to signal presence. She dismounted slowly, heart steady but alert, and inside found nothing taken. Nothing moved, except the freight registry paper she had tucked into her saddlebag, now resting on the workbench as if it had been handled. She had not placed it there. Whoever entered wanted her to understand one thing. The rumor was collapsing, but the control was not. And this time, the message had come from inside the barn. Lila did not wait for morning. She rode back into town before noon with the freight registry folded inside her coat and walked straight into the mercantile again. Not to argue, but to watch, because yesterday's silence had not been accidental, and today she intended to see who would speak first. The storekeeper stiffened when she entered, and before she could ask for salt or flour, Hale stepped out from between the supply shelves as if he had been expecting her. "Back already?" he said mildly, though his eyes were measuring the room. Lila set a small list on the counter and said, "I'll take what's written." The storekeeper hesitated, then shook his head. "Orders are limited this week." It was not true. The shelves were full. Gideon entered a moment later, not by chance, and did not acknowledge Hale at all. He placed exact coin on the counter and said, "Fill her list." The refusal collapsed instantly under his steady tone, and the items were gathered without another word. Hale leaned against the post near the door and smiled faintly. "You're buying more than groceries, Clarke." Gideon replied, "I only buy what's owed." The exchange was brief, controlled, and carried enough weight that two men near the window stepped outside rather than remain in it. When Lila carried the sack toward her horse, she noticed Gideon checking the axle pin of her wagon before she even reached the hitch rail. It was missing, not fallen, removed. Without it, the wheel would have slid loose halfway down the road. Gideon did not comment theatrically. He replaced it from his own saddle kit and tightened the brace until the wood held firm. "He's moved from rumor to risk," he said quietly. Lila met his gaze without fear. "Then he's misjudged the cost." Hale stood 10 paces away watching, hands folded loosely behind his back, not approaching, not retreating. The threat was no longer in words. It was in proximity. As Gideon stepped aside to let Lila mount, Hale spoke once more, calm and almost courteous. "Every man has a limit, Clarke. We'll see where yours sits." Gideon adjusted his cuffs again, the same way he had at the dance. "You'll find it." Lila rode home alone, groceries balanced securely, mind clear, because something had shifted beyond intimidation. Hale was no longer attempting to isolate her. He was testing how far Gideon would step into the open, and that meant this was no longer just about a freight rumor. When she reached the barn, she dismounted carefully and checked the tack herself before entering, determined not to miss another sign. Inside, the workbench was untouched, the registry paper still where she had left it this time. But near the door she found a small groove carved shallow into the wood beam at shoulder height, a mark deliberate enough to signal presence, yet subtle enough to deny accusation. It was not vandalism. It was a message. Someone had stood there long enough to leave a sign and walk away unhurried. She stepped back outside and looked toward the freight road. No rider. No dust. only the certainty that this was escalating without noise. And for the first time, she understood something else clearly. Hale was not trying to frighten her into leaving quickly. He was trying to make staying feel unsafe enough that she would leave on her own. She rose before dawn and saddled her horse without waiting for light, determined not to let the carved mark or the missing axle dictate her pace, and she checked every strap twice before tightening the girth, her movements steady, deliberate, unwilling to grant fear the shape of hesitation. The ride toward the outer fence line was uneventful for the first mile, the road firm, the rhythm familiar, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that Hale had exhausted his quiet gestures and would retreat to rumor again. Then the bridle jerked hard beneath her hand. The leather snapped at the weakened buckle Gideon had temporarily stitched, and the horse lunged forward, startled by the sudden slack. Lila kept her seat, but lost her balance for half a stride as the animal surged toward the slope, hooves striking loose ground that would have turned dangerous had she not forced the reins tight against the bit with one decisive pull. The horse reared once and settled, breath sharp, eyes wide, and she dismounted immediately, heart controlled but aware that this had not been chance. The slice in the leather had been deeper than it appeared. Someone had counted on weight and speed, finishing what a blade began. Gideon arrived from the side trail within minutes, not racing, not panicked, but direct, as if he had anticipated where she would ride. He examined the broken strap and ran his thumb along the cut. "Clean work," he said, voice even. Lila did not look at him. "He wants injury now." Gideon nodded once. "He wants you shaken." There was no speech about protection, no raised vow. Instead, he replaced the entire bridle with one from his own saddle, adjusting it with quiet efficiency before handing her the reins. "Ride mine," he said. "Yours comes back with me." It was not rescue. It was exchange. Lila hesitated only long enough to understand the gesture. If she rode his horse, she rode under his visible claim of alignment, and that alignment would not go unnoticed. She mounted without argument. As they turned back toward the road, a rider appeared on the ridge for a brief moment, distant but deliberate, watching the repair before angling away. Neither of them waved. Neither called out. The message had been delivered and answered without noise. When they reached the crossroads, Gideon stopped and said, "He's escalating because the rumor failed." Lila met his gaze. "Then he's running out of room." Gideon did not smile. Men like Hale don't run. They calculate. She understood that difference. Calculation meant one final move, something public enough to recover control. As she rode toward home on Gideon's horse, she noticed something she had not before. The freight registry paper she carried now felt less like evidence and more like bait. Hale knew it existed. Hale knew Gideon had seen it, and now he had shifted from subtle intimidation to physical risk. When she reached her gate, she found the barn door closed this time, latch secure, nothing disturbed. The silence was intentional. Whoever had cut the bridle did not need to circle the barn again. The warning had been sent. The attempt had failed. And that meant the next move would not be quiet at all. Lila did not have to wait long to see what Hale's next move would be, because by late afternoon, a rider from town arrived with a folded notice bearing the stamp of the Freight Commission, and the words inside were carefully chosen to sound official without yet being law, stating that a formal review would take place at the Mercantile Hall regarding missing registry bonds tied to her late husband's final rote. It was not an arrest. It was not a charge. It was something worse for a small town. Suspicion announced before proof. Gideon read the paper once and handed it back without comment, but she saw the tightening in his jaw that meant he had expected this escalation. He couldn't injure you, Gideon said quietly, so he'll try to isolate you. Lila folded the notice and tucked it into her coat. Then I won't hide from it. The meeting was set for the next evening, timed precisely when the largest number of ranchers would already be in town to settle accounts before winter. Hale had chosen his stage well. By the time Lila stepped into the hall the following night, the benches were already filled with men who had heard pieces of the story, but not its source. Gideon entered beside her within the first minute, not standing behind, not ahead, but directly at her shoulder where his presence was unmistakable without being theatrical. Hale was already there, composed, dressed plainly, and speaking in a tone that suggested reason rather than accusation. He explained that registry bonds tied to the Mason freight line had vanished after Thomas Carter's final delivery, and that financial loss required clarification. He did not call Lila a thief. He did not need to. The implication was carefully laid across the room like a net. When asked if she had knowledge of any stored documents, Lila answered evenly that she possessed only her husband's duplicate freight registry and that it matched every recorded delivery. Hale smiled faintly and suggested that duplicates could be altered. The room shifted. That was the moment Gideon stepped forward, not to defend her character, but to alter the frame of the discussion. He asked Hale to state clearly whether any sheriff's investigation had confirmed missing bonds, or whether this hearing was being conducted before law enforcement had examined the registry trail. Hale hesitated for half a breath, then admitted the sheriff had not yet found proof of disappearance, only a discrepancy in recorded commission totals. Gideon nodded once. So tonight is speculation. The word hung in the air. Lila then produced the original registry sheet Thomas had left sealed inside the stove compartment, a document she had brought not because she felt guilty, but because she refused to let Hale narrate the facts unchecked. She laid it flat before the committee table, allowing every eye to see the signatures and freight marks. The commission clerk compared it against town copies and found no difference. Hale's expression did not crumble, but it cooled. He had expected hesitation, not preparation. As the meeting dissolved without formal charge, Lila felt the weight shift, not toward safety, but toward inevitability. Hale had miscalculated publicly. Men like him did not forgive public miscalculation. And as she stepped outside into the dim light with Gideon beside her, she understood that the next move would not be paperwork at all. The warning came at dawn, not with shouting, but with silence, the kind that felt wrong before it could be explained. Lila noticed it first when the delivery cart failed to return from the lower ridge route at the hour it always did, and Gideon noticed it seconds later when one of his hired hands rode in hard without the team. The axle had split on a narrow incline, the wheel nearly torn free, and the crate of freight goods meant for 3 neighboring ranches had slid halfway into the ravine before being caught against a rock shelf. No one had been injured, but the break itself was too clean, too deliberate, the wood cut along the grain instead of cracked by strain. Gideon did not speak immediately. He examined the splintered axle in the yard while Lila stood beside him, steady, waiting for the truth rather than comfort. It didn't fail, he said at last. It was weakened. The men around them exchanged looks they tried to hide. Freight reliability was reputation. Reputation was survival. If word spread that her line was careless, the town would not wait for proof before choosing someone else. Lila knelt to inspect the fracture herself, tracing the smooth cut hidden beneath the outer wood. It was done before the load, she said quietly. Not during. Gideon met her eyes then, and she saw that he had already drawn the same conclusion. This was not rumor. This was escalation. By midday, Hale's assistant had already been seen in town speaking with 2 merchants about delayed goods, implying that Lila's management had grown unstable under pressure. It was a clever strike, not against her name directly, but against the trust others placed in her reliability. Lila understood that trust, once shaken, did not fully return. She refused to let it shake. Instead of retreating, she ordered the damaged cart repaired in the open yard where everyone passing could see it. Gideon did not argue. He simply brought his strongest team forward and replaced the axle himself, not as a rescuer, but as a partner, making it visible that her operation stood intact. While the repairs were underway, Lila walked the ridge road where the sabotage had occurred. She did not search blindly. She measured the ground for signs of weight, spacing, boot depth. Halfway down the incline, she found what she expected: a second set of tracks pressed into softer soil near the turnout, not belonging to her men. The stride was long, the heel heavy, someone confident enough not to hurry. She did not say Hale's name aloud. She did not need to. When she returned, Gideon listened without interruption, and then made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of confronting Hale privately, he sent word to the 3 ranches awaiting delivery that the freight would arrive the next morning ahead of schedule, with no additional fee. It was a risk. It required night loading and steady driving through narrow terrain. Lila approved it instantly. If Hale's plan was to seed doubt, they would answer with visible precision. That evening, as they prepared the replacement cart, Gideon said only one thing, low enough that no one else heard. "He thinks pressure will make you fold." Lila secured the crate straps herself and replied without looking up. "He doesn't understand what I've already survived." The cart rolled out before sunrise, stronger than before. But neither of them mistook this for the end. Sabotage meant desperation. And desperation rarely struck just once. The freight arrived on time. Not early, not late, exactly as promised, and that precision did more to quiet doubt than any public defense ever could. By mid-morning, the 3 ranchers who had nearly withdrawn their contracts were standing in Gideon's yard, examining the crates themselves, checking seals, lifting lids, testing the integrity of the repaired axle, as though they expected to find weakness. They found none. Lila watched without hovering. She understood that reputation wasn't defended with speeches but with consistency. When the men finally nodded, satisfied, the shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The doubt Hale had tried to plant did not take root. Instead, something else did. Curiosity. Why had Gideon chosen to bind his standing so firmly to hers? Why had he responded not with anger but with accuracy? Hale did not remain silent. By afternoon he arrived in town, not furious, but controlled, dressed in a way that suggested reason rather than rivalry. He called for a small meeting at the Mercantile under the pretense of clarifying transport reliability concerns. It was a clever move. Publicly questioning Lila's operation without direct accusation allowed him to appear prudent instead of vindictive. Gideon attended without invitation, standing near the back of the room, quiet as ever. Lila stepped forward when her name was mentioned, not waiting to be defended. Hale spoke calmly about recent mechanical failures and the need for stronger oversight, implying that independent operators without stable capital posed risks to the valley's supply chain. The language was polished. The intent was sharp. What he did not expect was Lila's response. She did not argue his phrasing. She agreed with it. "Oversight matters," she said evenly. "So does proof." Then she placed the damaged axle section on the counter before him, turning it so the clean cut beneath the grain was visible. "Wood doesn't split like this under load," she continued. "It splits like this when someone weakens it first." The room quieted. Hale did not flinch, but he did not deny it either. Instead, he shifted ground. "Are you accusing me?" he asked mildly. Lila met his eyes. "I'm stating that someone believed rumor would be easier than competition." The distinction mattered. She was not emotional. She was exact. Gideon spoke only once, and when he did, it altered the room. "If anyone doubts her reliability," he said, voice steady, "my contracts now include her roots. If they fail under my name." It was not romance. It was alignment. The ranchers exchanged looks, recalculating. Hale's leverage depended on isolation. Gideon had just removed it. The meeting dissolved without resolution, but the message was clear. The attempt to corner her publicly had failed. As people stepped outside into the yard, Lila exhaled slowly. She had expected Gideon to defend her privately, perhaps even to confront Hale alone. Instead, he had risked his own standing openly. She turned to him once the others had dispersed. "You didn't have to bind your name to mine," she said. He held her gaze, not soft, not dramatic, simply direct. "I don't bind my name lightly." The statement carried weight beyond business. That night the valley was quieter, but not settled. Hale had been challenged in front of witnesses. Men like him rarely retreated cleanly. And as Lila secured the yard gates before dusk, she noticed something that did not belong. A fresh rope tied around one of the freight mules, knotted incorrectly, as though someone had handled it in the dark. The next move, she understood, would not be about reputation. It would be about pressure. The rope on the freight mule was wrong, tied in a tight inward loop that would tighten under strain instead of release. And Lila did not need anyone to explain what that meant. If the animal bolted under load, the knot would choke it or snap the line, ruining both mule and shipment in a single careless-looking accident. She untied it slowly, studying the fiber. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Gideon's. It was newer, stiffer. Someone had entered the yard after the meeting. She didn't wake the ranch hands. She didn't call for help. She went to Gideon's porch instead and knocked once. He opened the door fully dressed, as though he hadn't slept. She held up the rope without speaking. He took it, ran his thumb over the knot, and his jaw tightened. "He won't risk open damage," Gideon said quietly. "He'll try to make it look like your fault." That was the real danger. Not fire, not theft. Ruin disguised as incompetence. Lila nodded once. "Then we don't give him darkness." Gideon stepped past her without hesitation. Together they walked the perimeter of the freight yard with lanterns, checking every latch, every harness buckle, every wheel brace. At the third wagon they found it, a small wedge removed from the rear brace pin, just enough to loosen under downhill strain. It would have failed halfway through a descent, not immediately, not visibly sabotaged, just weak enough to turn risk into blame. Lila replaced it with one of Gideon's steel pins. "He thinks I'll panic," she said, voice level, "or accuse him loudly." Gideon shook his head. "He thinks you'll retreat." That word settled heavier than the sabotage itself. Retreat. It was what widows did, what independent operators did when pressed by men with deeper pockets. Lila stood still for a moment, then made a decision that shifted the course of the night. "Load the wagons now," she said. "We leave before dawn." Gideon studied her, not questioning, just measuring. Then he nodded. They worked in silence, tightening harnesses, checking axles, reinforcing braces. The ranch hands joined without being summoned once they realized what was happening. No one asked why the departure had moved forward. By the time the horizon began to pale, the freight line was ready. Lila mounted the lead seat herself. Gideon rode alongside, not as escort, not as overseer, but parallel. The descent out of the valley was steady, controlled. At the halfway turn, she deliberately slowed, forcing the line into a tighter formation so any hidden weakness would show early. Nothing gave. The steel pin held. The mule with the altered rope moved cleanly under corrected tension. They reached the trading post by noon, ahead of schedule. 3 buyers were already there, summoned by Hale's earlier whispers. They watched carefully, expecting visible flaw. Instead, they saw reinforced rigs, disciplined handling, and on-time arrival. One of them stepped forward after inspecting the wagons. "We heard there were reliability concerns," he said carefully. Lila met his eyes without heat. "You're standing in front of the route." Gideon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The buyers signed renewed contracts before the freight was even fully unloaded. By the time the line turned back toward the valley, word had outrun them. Hale's strategy depended on erosion. What he received instead was consolidation. That evening, as they approached the ranch gate, Lila slowed her mule. "You knew he'd escalate," she said quietly. Gideon didn't deny it. "I knew he wouldn't stop at rumor." She looked at him more closely then, not as ally, not as rescuer, but as something steadier. "And you stayed anyway," he answered without hesitation. "I don't stand beside people I expect to fail." It wasn't romance. It wasn't even confession. It was something stronger, choice under pressure. As they entered the yard, Lila understood that the freight route had survived more than sabotage. It had survived isolation. And when Gideon dismounted and reached for the wagon brake without being asked, she realized he had not come to guard her business. He had come to share the weight of it. The valley would not quiet overnight. Hale would not vanish. But the line had held, and neither of them had stepped back. Hale did not appear the next morning, nor the one after, and the absence was more telling than any confrontation would have been. Word had spread faster than accusation ever could. The freight arrived early, the buyers renewed without hesitation, and Gideon had placed his own contracts beside hers without condition. In 1870, reputation did not recover quietly. It hardened. By the end of the week, 2 new merchants requested placement on Lila's route, not because they favored her, because she had proven unshakable under pressure. That mattered more than sympathy ever could. Lila stood in the yard, reviewing the updated manifests when Gideon approached with a folded document in his hand. It was not a contract. It was a deed copy. "Hale tried once more," he said evenly. "Filed a challenge claiming your late husband's wagon license transferred through debt." Lila felt no surge of panic, only calculation. "And?" Gideon held out the paper. "The clerk rejected it. The original license bears your husband's mark and your countersign. You were listed as operating partner." She studied the ink, steady and unmistakable. Her husband had written her name beside his, long before she understood why that would matter. Gideon watched her carefully. "He prepared for this," Gideon added. "It wasn't flattery. It was recognition." Lila folded the paper once and set it aside. "Then I'll honor it." The freight yard had grown busier over the month. New crates, additional hands, a second mule team purchased outright instead of leased. Stability was visible now, not whispered. That evening, as the men finished securing the rigs, Gideon remained by the gate rather than riding back to his own place. He had done this often lately, staying until the last latch was fastened, not out of suspicion, but habit. Lila approached him without summons. "You can return to your ranch," she said. "The yard stands." Gideon didn't move. "It does." The pause that followed held more weight than any public defense ever had. In 1870, no one announced attachment plainly. It was measured in work shared, in land aligned, in names spoken without hesitation. Gideon finally met her gaze fully. "You don't need protection," he said. "You never did." She held his eyes without lowering hers. "And you don't offer it lightly." He shook his head once. "No." The wind lifted dust through the yard, quiet and ordinary. No danger this time, no rumor, no rope tied wrong in the dark, just work finished and gates secured. Lila considered the years ahead, the contracts expanding, the weight of the route increasing. Strength was easier with 2 hands on the line instead of 1. "If you bind your name," she said carefully, "it won't be under mine. It will be beside it." Gideon's answer came without delay. "Beside it." The agreement required no witness, but one would come. Within the month, the valley clerk recorded a partnership deed, Wilder and Carter Freight. Not as rescue, not as merger, as equal claim. The wedding that followed was brief, practical, attended by the same buyers who had once doubted her reliability. No spectacle, no grand display, just signatures placed with steady hands. When the final ink dried, Lila did not remove her late husband's ring. She wore it still, but now on a chain beneath her collar, not erased, not replaced. Gideon did not ask her to change it. He understood the difference between survival and forgetting. That evening, as the wagons stood aligned in the yard under fading light, Lila walked the route line once more, checking harnesses as she always had. Only now, when she reached the final brace, another hand tightened it with hers. She once stood alone defending a name whispered with doubt. Now she chose where it stood, not behind a man, not beneath one, but beside him. And in a valley that once measured her by rumor, her name no longer needed defense. It carried weight on its own. If you were in Lila's place, would you have left the valley after the rumors started, or stayed and fought for your name? Tell me what you would have done. If this story meant something to you, like and subscribe Native American Tales for more.